Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, is a former goalkeeper for a well known soccer club and the lead singer for a Rolling Stones cover band. He also taught for more than 20 years as university professor of macroeconomics, economics of growth, microeconomics, and mathematics for economists.
Mhm.
An iconic moment in his campaign for president was a video that went viral where he's dressed up in a yellow and black suit with a mask and a cape, singing Giuseppe Verdi's classical operatic piece La Traviata as an anti money printing parody. His aides shouted as the song ended, "A round applause for Javier, General ANCAP." ANCAP is short for anarcho capitalist, the new president's proclaimed ideology. Milei believes the state is not the solution, the state is the problem. I'm here with Jeffrey Tucker, my old friend, wonderful man. Jeffrey Tucker, you founded Brownstone Institute based in part on this idea. You are also an outstanding protege of Murray Rothbard, who coined the term. I find it all very appealing, but there are obviously a lot of practical problems with it. So, what's this all about?
I have to say, it's something of a refreshing thing to see a head of a state at least proclaim a philosophy. I mean, that's the first thing that's kind of remarkable. I wish actually that I've thought of about this for years. Like, why don't we ask our candidates what they think about government? What's their philosophy towards public life? How do they think the world works? It obviously impacts on how they're going to be governed, but I don't recall ever hearing a person being asked that question. The last last major figure we've had at any high levels in the United States who had a philosophy of governing was Ronald Reagan, of course, and
Well, you mentioned that. I actually said to somebody this morning, he reminded me of Reagan in this
Mhm.
sense, is that Reagan spent 10 years on the road giving his speeches for GE, and he spent every single day reading the great writers and thinkers, developing his own views about that and writing his speeches. And so he developed a deep bedrock philosophy. And the reason I mentioned Milei's 20 years as economist is that he did the same thing. I mean, he knows his stuff and he knows what works and what doesn't work. And it's
Mhm.
the same thing that you and I think. I think it's a fantastic uh, place to start. And
Well,
he's
at
going to
least
have
we
so
know what
many
he
enemies. I think he might withstand the barrage.
maybe, and he's fighting philosophically in the first instance, which I find just intriguing. At least people know exactly what he believes, and he says it with a great deal of confidence. He says, the state has failed, the market works, freedom works, the government management does not. He gave yesterday a long talk about the failure of socialism, communism, fascism, central planning, political despotism over society, and about the virtues and beauties of freedom itself, and how business needs to be free of regulations, and we need to have enforcement of property rights at all levels of society. It was really striking to hear him say all this stuff. So Milei came to all these ideas as an economist, and as you probably know, there's a great deal of mainstream economics that's very vulnerable to attack, or I would say, like, actually falling apart once you examine it carefully. And this is what happened to him. He started looking at it, particularly on the question of industrial organization, antitrust theory, and monopoly, and bumped into the work of Murray Rothbard,
Yeah.
who I think has written some of the most compelling critiques against mainstream monopoly, antitrust, competition theory there are. I mean, he was actually better than his own mentor, who was Ludwig von Mises, who's just great. But Rothbard became very precise on this stuff and really just shredded the whole thing. And Millet said that after he read that, he realized he'd been teaching the subject incorrectly for the last 20 years,
Yeah.
and went through a major intellectual metamorphosis, and then obviously started feeling as if Rothbard had a lot to say about a lot of subjects, and so threw himself into it. My guess is he read the last section of Rothbard's great treatise called Man, Economy, and State. And it's the section where it's called Power and Market, actually. It was published as a separate book. Now it's all together in one. But it's a wonderful thing because he takes apart every conceivable form of government intervention in the economy and shows what's wrong with it. I mean, it's really quite a relentless. If there's one thing I could just give every would-be statesman something to read, it would be this, because it just shreds the whole apparatus of government itself, and I think that's what pushed Milei over the top. Now Rothbard called himself an anarcho-capitalist, and so now Milei calls himself that, which is a funny term, and I've had my inbox just flooded actually ever since his rise. There's people asking me, "What is this anarcho-capitalism?" Which makes me laugh because I guess I've lived with the term for so long. I just assumed everybody kind of knew what it was, but it turns out that's not.
Nobody knows what that means. You may be the only person.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Murray came up with the term in part as a reaction against the anarcho-socialists. So in New York intellectual culture, everybody who proclaimed themselves an anarchist, and this is true for a large part of the 20th century, had socialist leanings, syndicalist leanings, socialist leanings. They didn't believe in private property. They didn't believe in capitalism, obviously. I mean, Noam Chomsky is a good example of that. A guy who claims
well, calling yourself an anarchist in New York, particularly Greenwich Village, was a great way to meet girls. I mean, it was a very sexy thing to be countercultural.
Yeah. So anarchism has generally belonged to the left. Sure. I have to look back even to Marx. I mean, Marx called himself an anarchist because all the socialists called themselves anarchists. Well, Murray's view was that, and he got this view in part from his mentors, Ayn Rand and Ludwig Mises, was that if you leave people alone, they will figure out how to create private property and how to protect it. Because the protection of private property is most compatible with the thing we all want, which is peace with our neighbors. You can't have peace with your neighbors unless you recognize what's the difference between mine and thine. That's how we get along with each other, recognizing who owns what. So in the course of human evolution, we've figured out how to obtain peace with each other through protection of our rights to private property and the freedom to exchange that property. That's how we benefit from each other, is by recognizing and respecting property rights and then engaging in trade with each other. So
as you pointed out, as you wrote in your piece in the Epic Times, it's not a plan.
Right.
It's a prediction. And it's
right.
a prediction of what you come up with after people interact voluntarily with each other.
That's the critical thing. And there's a view on the left that's been pervasive for a very long time, that we only have private property because of a ruling class imposition of some law or some conspiracy by the courts or by the king or something. And it was Murray's view, as was his mentor Mises and Ayn Rand, that you have private property because of the existence of certain limits in the world, that limit being scarcity, which is to say we can't all own the same thing at the same time. That's not possible. I mean, this coffee cup is mine. If somebody takes it from me, it's no longer mine. That's why we need to figure out some rules for the engagement of the material world. And the number one rule we've come up with is private property. It didn't have to be imposed by the king or a court. It could be protected by a king or protected by a court, but it can also be protected by private title companies, which exist all over the United States and always have in the history of capitalism.
Well, you see a lot of claims for private property in kindergarten. It's a fairly basic instinct we have that this is mine.
Yeah, and so the idea of Rothbardian anarchism was to say, well, I'm an anarchist, but I believe in private property, and it wasn't just over things like consumer goods or the things around me. He believed strongly that there should be private property in the means of production itself, namely capital. Okay, so he thought that capitalism itself was an outgrowth of voluntary interaction. If you leave everybody alone, they will, on their own, create capitalism. So, that was an unusual view, actually.
But I've thought for a long time, and you've studied this much more than I have, but one of the principal sources of the wealth creation in the West, Western Europe and so forth, from the 12th, 13th, 14th century, was the protection of private property.
Yeah.
And as we've evolved from a feudal society to a bourgeoisie with property and ownership of the means of production and things like that, that was the thing that drove the dramatic
Sure.
growth in the economy
Sure.
and
Sure.
the innovation.
Sure. And even
You own your innovation. The king didn't own it.
yeah, that's right. And I guarantee you, you could look around the world today and find, and the poorest societies in the world, and one of the reasons, the major reason they're poor, is because they don't protect property over capital. So you look at a place like Haiti. What happens? Everybody in Haiti is entrepreneurial. They're enterprising. They're working hard. They're not lazy people, lazy bums, or whatever. Everybody's working hard. The problem is, anybody gets rich and develops a pool of capital from which they can hire laborers and invest in the future, it gets pillaged by the state. Right. So the absence of private property and capital is a major reason for poverty.